2 o'clock. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's meeting of the Environment and Transport Overview and Scrutiny Committee. Can I please remind everybody that the meeting this afternoon will be broadcast live via the County Council's website and also available for viewing afterwards. I'd be pleased if everybody could switch their mobile phones to silent at least, or switch them off. And can you please switch on your microphone when you start to speak and switch it off again when you've finished speaking. Thank you. You will see some new faces around the table this afternoon, and that is the Chair, the Vice Chair and Labour spokesman of the Children and Families Scrutiny Committee, who we've invited to come and comment on item 8. You're welcome, all three of you. So, can we first move to item 1 on the agenda? Can I propose that the minutes of the meeting held on the 18th of January be signed as a true and accurate record? Is everybody happy? I think so, yes. Thank you. Item 2, question time. I have received no questions. And questions asked by members under standing orders, I've received none of those either. There are no urgent items under item 4. Can I move therefore to declarations of interest? Has anybody got any declarations of interest on this afternoon's proceedings? Blake.
Many thanks, Chairman. Can I just declare a personal interest in item 8, the mainstream and special educational needs homeschool transport policy? I have family members that work for a transportation company, but I do not have a pecuniary interest.
Thank you. Anybody else? No? That's fine. Item 6, are there any declarations of the whip to declare? No? So we go straight on to item 7, which is a presentation of a petition on street lighting, asking that all night operations be returned to Broughton Astley. You will see that in the papers that we've been given, there are some responses from members of the public to this item, and we asked the lead member, the local member, I beg your pardon, who is Mr. Licorice, if he'd like to make a comment. Unfortunately, he can't be here. He's asked me to read out his comments to you, which I do now. First and foremost, I've looked at the names on the petition. I know that Broughton Astley is one of the largest villages in Europe, if not the largest, but to be world-renowned and countrywide renowned is quite remarkable on such a local issue as street lighting, so I'll not pay too much attention to the names recorded. I did some time ago put my points of view to Mrs. Julia Harding, and I told her we have a very good relationship with the local police team in Broughton Astley, and would have a high regard to any comments they make around street lighting problems, if any. She is right in saying that the council made its decision on part night lighting, but fails to say that it was after consultation with the residents, through the parish council in Broughton Astley, and through the media, local media, including a newsletter, Broughton Matters, which is circulated to every household. She also makes the point about people coming out of the public houses after midnight. I think on that score that any vulnerable person would make arrangements to be transported home safely at that time of night. I also pointed out that there are savings on energy costs and carbon emissions and light pollutions. I explained to Julie that I represent nearby villages, namely Ashby Magna and Parva, Lear and Frolsworth. It's a name of a village I've never heard of. All have elected to control their own street lighting and have their own lamp system to cut down on light pollution and to blend in with the village scene. I have had no direct approaches to me about street lighting timings apart from 2 people being against the petition. And you will see the lead petitioner's comments and the comments of 2 residents in your pack. Can I now ask the Director, Anne, the Director of Environment and Transport, to present her report on the responses to this petition, shown on pages 11 and 12 of your agenda pack. Anne.
Thank you, Chair. There were actually 502 signatories to the petition when we looked at Leicestershire residents. And as you quite rightly say, this was requesting that park night lighting was returned to all-night operation. Park night lighting in Broughton Astley is not a new thing. It's been in operation since 2011, June 2011 to be precise. And actually when we put it in, we worked closely with the police and the community to understand where it could go in and how it would best operate. Today, widely, that we work with the police to understand implications of park night lighting, and there isn't any evidence that they're coming up with or we're finding that actually relates park night lighting to crime. On receiving this particular petition, however, we specifically asked the police, is there any issues there? Could you give us your views in terms of crime in Broughton Astley in particular? Their feedback was that there was no evidence to show that park night lighting was a factor in crime and didn't recommend any changes to the current scenario. On that basis, and on the basis of the policy that Cabinet obviously agreed to this particular initiative, park night lighting, is proposed that we retain the park night lighting in Broughton Astley.
Thank you, Anne. Members, would you like to make any comment or ask Anne any further questions? Blake, you'd like to make a comment? Oh, I'm sorry. Paul.
I would support the recommendation based on the evidence. There's one thing that was raised by Julie Harding in her letter, and I don't know if this is possible, but it might be worth an answer. Can they, as they are installed, can the lights at all be dimmed, or are they either on or off?
We control the lights through a central management system and they can be dimmed. That is an option. They can be turned off, they can be turned on, and we can dim them, we can control them. We are looking in the medium term to, if there's anything further we can do in terms of dimming the stock across the county at particular times of the day. So that is a factor, and it is something that's on our radar to look at. So we do have that possibility.
Just to put on record, it seems to me that the Broughton Astley residents have been well consulted on the proposal for the lighting, and in this case, with the police evidence, there's no evidence to show there's any increase in crime. That's the basis of saying I wouldn't support the petition.
Yes, Blake.
Chairman, just to add to the Director's comments, I note Julie Harding has sent a representation, and no doubt she would have been here today if it were not for the weather, and we thank her for sending this representation in. To follow on from what Councillor Bremner has just said, the point I'd like to make, this isn't simply about financial savings. Yes, it is saving the Council a huge amount of money, but I think we all need to be minded that we're in the business of saving some environmental costs too. This particular policy will reduce our kilowatt hours from 26 million kilowatt hours to about 10.5 million kilowatt hours of energy of street lighting across Leicestershire. And also our CO2 emissions will reduce by about 59% to 5,000 tonnes of CO2 emissions, which is very commendable. So, you know, we need to be minded that it's not simply about financial savings, it's about the environmental savings, which we have obligations and responsibilities about too. I think the policy as it stands is a fair one. We are guided by the police, and following the investment we've put into the LED street lighting, we are able to have more control over our lights, and the Director's just spoken about looking at options in terms of how we can dim them and create the environmental savings we seek, as well as the financial. But on this particular ask, I think we've got clear evidence here from the police that there isn't necessarily a security risk or a crime risk associated with the policy in this area, and I'm supportive of the recommendations that have just been put to you by the Director.
Thank you. Mr. Poland.
Thank you, Chair. It's quite clear what I've heard today, and that's in line actually with what I've heard previously on that there isn't a correlation between crime and the lights being off at night. So on that basis, really what we're talking about, I guess, then is perceived crime, the feeling that the lights are off, and therefore logically it must lead to greater crime, even if the facts don't bear that out. This is not unique to Broughton Astley. I have similar issues in my division, similar comments in my division. I'm sure most, if not all, members would say the same. The issue for me then is, as has been said, the facts of the matter. So if we say on the perception alone is that the crime has gone up, even if the facts don't bear that out, therefore we will agree to putting the lights on in Broughton Astley. What's then to stop people in my division turning around and saying, well, Broughton Astley got it, why can't we? Other villages, why can't we? And actually you'd be then setting a precedent which would go to undermine the entire idea, I would county-wide, to be quite honest with you. So unless the evidence changes, I would suggest that the policy is a correct one, and I've heard nothing so far today which it makes me think that Broughton Astley is a special case, frankly. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other contributions? Mr. Hunt.
I wasn't intending to speak on this, but I just wanted to sort of correct some slight bias in this discussion. There's a perception out there that we set our rules by what county hall people think, and people who have the benefit of working normal hours and so on. In my division, I've found a lot of concern about this from people whose lives are not regular, or particularly who work shifts, and who keep this country going, at night in all sorts of ways, including the emergency services, incidentally. And when I speak to them, I do feel and understand what they're feeling. But what I do find is there's not enough information from County Hall, perhaps, or from the police about the measures that they can take to mitigate the action that the county's taken. And I'd include in that the sort of lighting devices that people can get in the home, which are now much cheaper than they used to be, and much more available. And the things you can carry for your own personal protection as well. Obviously torches come into this, but wearing bright clothing and that kind of thing that cyclists are well used to doing. So I think there's still a range of things we can do to support residents who don't live the 9-to-5 life that many of us have the luxury of doing.
Thank you. Mr. Bolter.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, it goes without saying, I assume that if police do recommend the lights go on, as they did in Oadby, we would look at it as favourable lights if they can produce evidence that they need lights to go on.
The question was that if the police advice is that crime has risen and lighting might affect it, what would the response of the county be?
Absolutely. Our initial response, if we have got, the police have evidence and are saying we think there is a factor and there's a link here because the crime's happening during the hours of darkness, etc., and there's an increased trend, is we will agree a trial period to switch those lights back on. And we will agree a review at the end of that period to see if we still think there's ongoing issues which necessitates the all-night lighting, or whether, issues seem to have gone and we can revert to part-night lighting. So we will put them back on. We always do it for a temporary period with the proviso of we will review at the end and decide, take the conclusions of that review before then, we go forward with part-night lighting or retention of all-night lighting.
Any further questions? No? I think we'll move on, if we may, to item 8. And the Director and Carruthers will present this report to us. Anne.
Thank you again, Chair. Members will recall that we came to scrutiny last November as part of the consultation on proposed changes to our discretionary SEN and mainstream home-to-school transport. We've now concluded that consultation and we're seeking Scrutiny's further views on the final proposals that are going to Cabinet next week under those policy changes. I just want to remind you again about the proposals and who they affect. It's discretionary transport for children with SEN, so that's under the age of 5 or with disabilities, and for young people, SEN 16 to 19, and other young people 16 plus. The 3 options we consulted on were low income exemption. Our current system is there is 100% discount for those on low income, and we were consulting on changing that so that it would be less than 100% discount. We also consulted on for post-16 SEN transport. Instead of providing dedicated transport, there actually would be an offer of a personal travel budget for that instead of providing that transport. That affected 320 individuals. And the final aspect of the consultation was for post-16 mainstream, where they would get a grant of £150 for those who are rurally, if I can even say it, isolated or in low income, and that affected 58 individuals. The consultation closed on the 21st of December. We got 226 responses in total, and they were largely very much in the vein of the consultation information we brought to you in that November committee meeting. In summary, just to give you a flavour of that, for the low income discount proposals, between 62 and 80% of respondents, so that depended on, it was broken down into the SEN post-16, the different categories, disagreed with the principle of reducing that discount, with only between 16 and 27% agreeing with that. For the post-16 SEN personal travel budgets, 83% disagreed, and 29% that felt that this would negatively affect family health or relationships or the ability to maintain employment. And for the third element of the consultation, post-16 travel grant, 59% disagreed. However, for the travel allowance for the rural isolation and the low income, the same amount of respondents agreed as disagreed. It was 42%. So, that one was a bit more mixed. The detailed summary are contained in paragraphs 36 to 48 of the report, and the full analysis is in Appendix B. The scrutiny, you'll note in the report that's going to Cabinet next week that scrutiny comments are included, so that's the comments from the November meeting, but obviously comments from today we will report to Cabinet as well. I just want to draw your attention to a submission by Dr. Einan that's been put in as part of this report in terms of the consultation responses and how they've been presented. I want to just highlight for you that the consultation analysis and reporting was carried out independently by our corporate business intelligence service, and that is professional researchers that are employed in there to do this. It wasn't the department or the service or anything like that. It was done independently for us. The report is comprehensive and balanced, and the results are presented clearly and objectively for each of the questions that were asked as part of that consultation exercise. We do include indicative quotations that actually help illustrate the points that were made, and they are in the respondents' own words. So, we're not skewing anything. That was actually what was said at the time. And clearly, I'm sure you will understand, expresses the depth of feeling that people had on this matter. It's clear from the report that the proposals were unpopular, and I know you had that view when we came and discussed it with you in November, and there was a high level of disagreement for the proposals. The responses from different demographic groups were analysed statistically using chi-squared. Now, please don't anybody ask me to, any technicalities on that, because I would have to delay and get information from, those professional researchers. But that is obviously a consistent industry norm in terms of how you would analyse such responses as these. It takes into account sample size, and it's appropriate to highlight statistically significant results between groups where they do exist to help interpret those results. Differences between groups are reported only where they're found to be statistically significant. So in response there to Dr. Einan's submission there, I hope that would address those points for Dr. Einan. Part of the process involved consulting Leicestershire Equalities Group, which has helped us identify particular mitigation actions we would want to develop, if approved by Cabinet, to make sure that we're minimising any impacts this policy would have. These mitigations are set out on the table on page 25 of the report in front of you. As a result of the consultation, there are a number of proposed changes to that policy. So the final proposals being put to Cabinet are as per paragraph 3b in the report, and I'll just summarise those for you before I stop. The low-income exemption is proposed being reduced from 100% to 50%. The normal full amount is £660. That would mean if on low income, there would be a £330 contribution rather than the full amount. For the personal travel budgets, they are being proposed for all eligible 16 to 18s with low-income families receiving the discount. What that means is they will receive an additional £330 allocation, because that's 50% of the full amount payable on top of their personal travel budget allocation. We also have increased our forecast or amount of exceptions we'd expect under this policy. As you will have seen from the consultation responses, it's been highlighted there may be cases where things like personal travel budgets just will not be appropriate. In our original consultation, we'd envisaged 10% exceptions. We've now budgeted for 20% exceptions so that we can, on a case-by-case basis, where they're put to us, consider whether there are exceptions, and we would provide the traditional transport rather than allocate a personal travel budget. And the final proposal was as originally proposed in terms of the travel grant of £150. Overall, as proposed in this report, we would make a saving of 0.8 million. That obviously would be subject to Cabinet approval and would come into effect from September 2019 if approved. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Anne. First thing I'd like to say is, in addition to the consultation responses, can I thank Dr. Ryan and Annie Bannister for their comments also. You remember Annie Bannister was somebody who spoke to us at our last meeting, and she has sent in further comments on the sheets attached. You will know that we scrutinised the consultation paper a couple of months ago, and the resulting report from that consultation is the bits that are attached. Our role here is to look at the recommendations and to comment on those recommendations, bearing in mind the comments we made last time. You will see the original consultation papers on page 18 of our report, and our original comments also attached on the bottom starting at the bottom of page 23. So, members, it's over to you. Can I start with Mr. Pearson?
Thank you, Chair. As in the past meeting discussing this, I think, as I mentioned before, we're dealing with people here and families with special needs, children with disability, etc. And I think it's very important we all remember this. Every individual is different, particularly when it comes to the different types of disability we're covering. And I think, as we mentioned before, it's come under the transport, but in reality, this should be a whole service situation. I think the report gives us a great opportunity in the future to pull this together and not just look at it in silos. So I think that's very positive. And to me, that's very important. I also like to bring the members' attention to a commission report on page 111, which I think is excellent, and that was commissioned from the School Transport LCG Task Force, and I think that's an important document, and it does support, and I'm very impressed with the transparency and honesty of the consultation from the officers. You've given it warts and all. You've not tried to hide anything, which I appreciate, and that's how it should be. I think we all agree with that. And I felt that very refreshing. back to the page number 13, I think this is why we've responded. So in B, from the consultation, I think we all agree that there has been some changes to the original options, and I'm impressed with that you've actually taken in stock. It's still not popular, I'm sure, but you've made some changes, and I think that's absolutely tremendous that we've thought it through, and I believe that shows the process working really well. I'm also, in the briefing we have, one of the main questions from the members that were there was the exceptional cases, and I think you answered it there, but I'd really clarify the situation after this is that where there is exceptional cases, where there is additional need, there will be assessments and there will be an opportunity to look at each individual family for its needs. I'd like to finally say, though, that it does give us an opportunity, and again, I've got to express it's a good report from the officers, but we mustn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. A lot of families that I know in Melton and other families around Leicestershire is they like the individual personal programmes. They also appreciate the individual budgets for transport. A majority of them manage their funds quite well, but not all of them. Not all of us are good at budgeting. I'm not that good because I used to leave it to my wife, and I've had to change that. But in reality, throughout, not just England, throughout the world, the individual programmes, individual budgets have been working very well for many years. It gives independence, it gives freedom to families, it gives them choice, and they're not being dictated to. But of course, I believe with the right bringing together of services, with the ongoing of this report, it gives us an opportunity to ensure that we make sure that those families in need get the services they deserve. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we go to Mr. Bolter, please?
Thanks, Chairman. Quite a few questions, as you can well imagine. First of all, what's the definition of low-income families? That's the first. Just one at a time. Make it easy for you. There's a lot.
Definition of low income is in receipt of maximum working tax credit or free school meals.
Okay, so that clarifies that point. Mr. Pearson's brought about exceptions to policy, and perhaps not to elude a bit on that for the rest of the members who went at the briefing this morning, what it means by exceptions to policy and the way you're working that out. I am concerned about all this, and I'm afraid I'm not in support of this. I think it's a step too far. I think we're penalising the most disadvantaged in society. People with children with disabilities have enough to suffer as it is, let alone have this cost put upon them. And I think quite a few families I know will be really struggling to find the extra money to pay for this transport. Whether they fall into an exceptional category or not is a matter that we'll find out sooner rather than later. I had one lady write to me who lives in my division, feels quite strongly about it, the effect it has on her and her family. And she says quite lightly that the possibility is that her child will not be going out of the house more than 2 days a week. That's all she can afford. So the rest of the time is going to fall on social services to provide support for her to keep that child in the home while she goes out to work. So it's an overall effect we've got to think about, not just the transport thing. And if it's going to affect the social care budget, that needs to be taken into account, because you might make a saving on one budget and pay more out on another. So, as Mr. Pearson says, we must look at it overall, and I hope that Blake, when he goes back to Cabinet, and Mrs. Radford, when they go there, will consider that it's not just what's before them, it's the greater environment that's going to affect them and these families. As for the effect on children at SEN transport, for the older children, will they continue with their education? I doubt it. I'm also concerned about families who choose to have their own transport. Will there be any escorts there? Will the person who takes the child have any first aid training? A lot of these children need first aid when they're travelling, so I'm concerned about that. And is there anything in place to make sure that they do take on board any first aid needs that the child has? At the moment, the escorts, I believe, have some first aid training. But families may choose another option that's not available. We're talking about wheelchair accessible vehicles. Are there enough to go around? If the county council pulls its transport fleet, are there enough vehicles to go around for these children? Has that work been done? Or we're going to have a shortfall on that? So there's many things I'm concerned about, and really, what was the point of doing consultation? No point at all, because you've got the consultation results, they're all against it, yet the Cabinet, I assume, will still go ahead and do it, even though the consultation says no. So I can't see the point of doing the consultation, because you totally ignored, yet again, what the local people think. I think that is very bad policy for the County Council. And I hope that the Cabinet think very deeply and hard about this before they bring these cuts into force. In the County Council budget, it's not a vast amount of money. There's other things that they could have done to save this amount of money, and I really do think this is affecting the most disadvantaged in our society. And we're here to protect those people who are disadvantaged, and this is not protecting them. And I think it's our duty to look after those families who can't look after themselves and their children in a way that's going to benefit the country in the future. So I won't be supporting this afternoon, and I hope my comments, if any of my colleagues join with me, those comments will go through to Cabinet. Thank you, Chair.
And did you pick out a number of questions there?
Mr. Bolter said he would give me them one at a time, but I've got 5 there anyway. Okay, it's a start. In terms of the exceptions, the process will be, obviously, we anticipate being contacted by the individuals concerned. We will have that conversation. In effect, it's like a flow chart. Either that conversation will conclude, yes, there is an exception for whatever reason, and therefore we will provide you transport the way we have been providing you, or no, we don't think there is an exception. That is done by the officers who deal with this on a daily basis. If the answer is no, and then the parent, carer, etc. is unhappy with that, we have a 2-stage appeals process. It's a statutory process. That first stage appeal, they will submit their evidence as reasoning as to why they think it's an exception, etc. That first stage will go to officers who have not been involved in the daily business, etc. of this, but who are well versed in this area of work. So they will independently review that and go back with an answer. If the answer is still, sorry, we don't think you're an exception, there's a second stage appeal. Now that appeal is actually, it goes to an independent panel. It tends to be, because we have this type of thing for, school, the home to school transport, compulsory, etc. That tends to be people who are well versed in this area of work, and technically actually it tends to be retired employees, etc., who we bring back and actually employ for the purposes of holding an appeal, and they will hear that appeal and then conclude on that. So there's a clear process of going through there. Just for examples, however, the types of things we will explore, because there isn't a clear set criteria on this, because as you understand, an exception must be and can only be on a case-by-case basis. Everybody's circumstances will be different. So we will be looking at questions, is there 2 parents there? What are the responsibilities to other children? What is the support network for that family, etc.? What are the other things? How do they transport the child themselves at non-school times, etc.? Is there anything there we can use? And if the answers, obviously go down no, it could then be put in the exceptions basket. But I must stress there isn't a checklist that you can tick off to say, yes, you'd be exception, no, you're not. Each one has to be looked at in an individual case. But there is a clear process of stages of appeal to go through that takes it into independence out with the original officers who have made that decision, that then goes through the whole process to look and clearly examine whether there should be an exception or not in that case. Next one I've got is about the affordability. And that obviously is a concern that has come up time and time again through the consultation. What we do is, and there isn't a set amount for a personal travel budget, it comes down to a number of factors, and again they are personal to that particular circumstance. Distance of travel, if an escort is required, etc. So the complexity of need is taken into account in that, it's factored in. It's not just a straight calculation and everybody gets the same amount, etc. However, yes, there is a concern then that that will not be sufficient to enable the parents or the carer to facilitate that transport. How we would monitor that is the payments are made monthly in advance, and actually if it's clear that that is not going to, in effect, that's not covering the needs of that particular instance, we will work with the parents or the carers as to look at what the solution is and what the issues are there. Is it being used in the best way? Is it being used the way they said? Or is there a real issue here and we might have to move them into an exceptions case? So it shouldn't get to the point halfway through a school year somebody said, I've run out of all the money you've given me, because we have got a monthly monitoring mechanism in place to do that. The third point about effect on social care budgets, you're absolutely right. There's no way we'd want to do this, to add tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands more onto other budgets, an increased budget, increased burden on the authority. One of the mitigations there in the table on page 25 is about working closely with our children's and families colleagues and the schools, that if there's any early indications that it would push a child, say, into residential or into some other kind of need of help, actually that is flagged up, and we would then go back and re-look at the case to see actually, is this an exception that needs a different type of support? So we're trying to pick up that as well as one of our mitigations. You mentioned about escorts and medical training for people, if they're arranging their own transport. That ultimately is up to the responsibility of the person who is then in charge of that personal travel budget, either the parent or the carer. Again, it comes back to the type of question, well, how do they transport that child, when it's travel to non-school, it's out with that, it's family, it's leisure time, etc. How do they, if the child has a need for a medically trained escort, you're absolutely right, we have a number of medically trained escorts who work across our fleet. If the child has that need, how does the family cater for that when they're not going to school and they're any other journey? And we'd want to look at that, and we'd encourage them to, apply the similar circumstances put in place for that. In terms of wheelchair accessible, hackney cabs tend to be in the vast majority wheelchair accessible. We have a large number of them in the county, and equally there are a number of other cars that are non-hackney, but people movers, that kind of thing, that are accessible. Our knowledge at the moment of the fleet does not give us a concern in terms of the number of accessible vehicles. Obviously, if that is flagged as a problem as we go through this, it's something we would want to then work with, we'd want to review in terms of this policy. And those particular individuals, if they were having a challenge getting an accessible vehicle where we need one. However, as I say, it's not something that we particularly think at the moment is going to be an issue. Given in total we're looking at between 400 and 500 families who are covered by this policy, a small percent of them will be wheelchair accessible, not the whole 100%, obviously. My last point, the last point I've got, I'll touch on quickly, but I've no doubt Blake would want to maybe add to it. What's the point of the consultation? The whole point of the consultation is to understand, what we think the impacts might be of doing this. And where there are impacts, what can we do if the decision is taken forward to implement this? What can we do to ensure that we're minimising those impacts? And I hope you can see through the report that we are putting in place things to minimise some of those impacts that have clearly been expressed through the consultation. Obviously, nobody wants to be, I don't want to be, you don't want to be, we'd rather not be doing this. We'd rather have pots of money, we can do everything we want to do, but we're not in that day and age anymore. So it's about how can we minimise that impact and balance the needs of what we need to be providing. Bear in mind, this is discretionary, this service. Some authorities up and down the country do very little compared to what we do. So it's about balancing those needs, providing for those who do need it in the best and most efficient way. We are still providing something. We're just changing how we've provided it from in the past. And we all know, yes, 0.8 of a million is small beer compared to, the whole county council budget. However, we all know that a lot of the times it's all these little things that count that help us to make those budget savings we have to ensure that we're not in the position of neighbouring authorities. I'm going to stop there.
Thank you. Blake, would you like to...
if I may, Chairman, I just want to add 3 points and just pick up on perhaps some of the more politically directed comments that Mr Bolter made, and thank Anne for explaining some of the mechanics that sit behind the policy. I think she did that really, really well. First and foremost, members will note that I've only recently been handed the portfolio, the passenger transportation portfolio. So can I just put on record my thanks to Pam Posnett, Councillor Posnett, for the work that she did in formulating this policy with the department. Obviously the consultation finished just before Christmas in December, and it's been very useful for the department and not least myself, because obviously coming at it from an objective perspective, a new fresh set of eyes, I've been able to try and understand the original proposals and what's being put forward right now. So the 3 points I just want to address head on. I actually reject, I appreciate this is a sensitive area, and I spoke about this at full council, but I do reject that we're removing support for some of the most vulnerable families in the country. Part of our responsibilities and obligations are enshrined in statute, in law. And there's nothing here that goes against that statute. So in that respect, the law protects this demographic, these people, and we will respect the law and we will do what we usually do, which is provide services, high quality services, to the best of our ability in that respect. On the point, is this a step too far? Well, I think Anne nearly touched upon what I'm about to say, but the initial savings target was over £1 million. What we're proposing here will save us about £800,000 in this respect. We are all aware of the financial constraints and pressures upon the authority, not least upon the Environment and Transport Department, and every area of business is having to find different ways of doing things to find the savings necessary to make sure that we're a solvent authority. And when we talk about is it a step too far, well, given that these are discretionary elements of service provision that we're talking about here, we could be looking at a Northamptonshire County Council situation where I might stand corrected, but there are many discretionary things that they currently do that have had to stop with immediate effect, not least within their transportation services department. And in spite of us being the lowest funded county council in the country, I think we've proven that we're also a low cost but a high performing council. And I think this policy is just an evolution in the way that we've conducted business to date. And finally, can I just comment upon the notion that we don't listen to consultation? Again, the director spoke about the purpose of consultation. But I do think in this instance, although I freely admit that I'm still getting to grips with some of the minutiae and the detail of this policy, which is why it's very helpful to listen to all members' contributions today about the policy, but I do think in this instance we can clearly demonstrate that what we proposed during the consultation has altered based on the consultation. For instance, we've listened and we're scrapping the decision to get rid of the discounted rate entirely for low-income families, as the director's already pointed out. So we have moved as a county council, we have listened, but we can't ignore the fact that we have financial constraints and we have to deliver a policy that's fundable within the resource envelope we've got. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Very helpful. Can I now go to Mr. Poland, please?
Thank you, Chair. To be honest, I think Anne's probably answered the questions I was going to ask. The first one was just about how we ensure that we are meeting the needs of the 50% of the disabled. Because where you live, as you quite rightly said, where you live, what your disability is, where you're going, and all of that are factors. So I was going to ask how we deal with that, but I think you've answered that question in the sense that we work with them on a month-to-month basis. And the next question linked to that is how we help people who aren't strong at budgeting, don't have those budget skills. But again, I think you probably touched on that in the sense if we work with them month-to-month, I would hope that that's something that we look at and that they'll be able to help them budget and help them manage. So thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Bremner, Dr. Bremner, please.
Thank you, Chair. Could I refer councillors to page 23, please? We had, at the last in November, 3 options. And since then, there's been a consultation. Since then, we've had reporting in here the mitigation measures for the policies proposed. And in the first option 1, it was to remove 100%. But if I go to the recommendation, it's a discount of 50%. So clearly the consultation has moved and has changed the policy. And I think that's an important thing to note. There's one question I have, just for clarity, and one other comment arising from Andy Bannister's notes. On page 21, on point 42, it says 43 respondents, 29%, consider that the proposals would have a negative, or paraphrase, a negative effect. Does that mean 71% felt that they had a positive effect? Within that, or is it a statistical highlight of the 43 respondents that would feel a negative effect? I'm only reading what is on the page.
Absolutely. I would have to double check because there may be some that have expressed no opinion. I couldn't say
exactly.
the other. I meant the other 79% or 71%.
It might be 70% no opinion.
No opinion precisely, or thought it would be marginal or something. I'd have to double check on that one. I couldn't categorically say at the moment.
But I think the more substantive point really arises from Annie Bannister's note on the second page, which has already been highlighted and has been indicated as well within her comments, because I think what she says is quite important in terms of the nuance and the individuality of each person. And having an assessment of someone in a great need and the requirement for someone to accompany them has already been covered, and I think you're covering that. But what I'm not clear about is if we've got, I think you said 400... I think it's 400 individuals, is that correct, or 400 families in this category?
It's individual. I think it did say families, but, I meant for each individual there will be a family or carer or.
In terms of transport to a school particularly, are there areas where a number of families go to the same school? Because what I'm saying is we've talked about how a response can be holistic in terms of service provision, but also holistic to the family. If we're looking at them at individuals, we might not look at them as a whole as well, because then you might see areas where you can link things together and do things as 2 families rather than 1, for instance, to the same place.
If I could just come back on that, Chair, if that's all right. Absolutely. If approved, there's a number of actions for us that we would be taking forward and working with schools and obviously the individuals affected by this. Now, one of them would be to work specifically with schools to ask them to have the conversation with their families, etc., who are affected, to see if either there's options, for instance, for car sharing, to see if even they would want to, for instance, pool all their personal travel budgets, and the school could provide one facility for them to come. We want to work with them to actually help facilitate where feasible. Obviously, it won't happen in every circumstance. There will always be individuals who are the only ones going from A to B, and it can only be managed individually. But where there's opportunities to pull together and look at one solution for a number of people, we want to work with the schools and we want to work with their families to do that.
Thank you. Can I invite Mrs. Seaton, please?
Thank you, Chair. I'm pleased to see that the Council has responded positively to the consultation and has reeled back from removing the discounted rate. Disability is not something that affects families living in poverty or are vulnerable from not having the family network to support. Some families will not want to be considered as the most vulnerable in our society. They are financially secure. and they have they work and are supported by family that could care and transport the children. So I think, as Anne already has explained, that all these cases will be treated and considered as all single and on their own merit. There are going to be exceptions, no doubt, and these should be approached with care and compassion, using the discretion to determine need that has already been explained. The personal transport budget, I think, is a new way forward and for post-16 students, and will give them the ability to plan for their own transportation from the home to their place of education. It's going to be an emotive subject, obviously, but I think this is the best of all of the options that were given to us. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Sheehan.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, as a visitor to this committee, I'm coming to the table rather late in the day with the process, but there are some questions that spring to mind. Have you done any kind of assessment of the dropout rate as a result of these changes? And can you say to what extent that will be improved by your mitigation measures?
We haven't done any assessment yet of a dropout rate of if this was implemented. What I can give you an example from, and I know it's slightly different, but it's the nearest thing we've got. We have offered voluntary PTBs, and so far to date, 135 families have taken them up. And my understanding is 4 out of those have dropped out to date. They've taken them up thinking it would suit them and actually finding it doesn't suit them. That's quite a small percentage. However, I will fully acknowledge they are the ones who have come forward to say, I think it will suit me in the first place. And, you know, I think the results of the consultation show at the moment there will certainly be an element of the people who are affected here who would not voluntarily come forward and take up a PTB, etc. So at the moment our experience is it's quite low. I probably would anticipate that actually for some people it will be more difficult, but that's what the exception's about, because in effect if people cannot manage on a PTB for whatever reason in terms of their own circumstances, that's what the exceptions is there for, to be able to deal with. And that's why we've put it at 20% as opposed to the 10% we'd originally worked to.
I'll just follow up on that, Chairman. I am concerned that you haven't got that estimate of the dropout rate, because without it you can't really know the true impact of these changes, nor can you be so sure how effective your mitigation measures might be. So it does leave us in a rather difficult position as to how we proceed when we don't have that basic fact.
I think the only way, however, we could get that dropout rate is by asking people through a consultation, would you drop out or would you not? And I think we know the response when we get to that one. And actually, as ever in these things, a lot of things are state of preference. What people say in a consultation can be quite different in reality. And I think, you know, from the whole tone of the consultation response, which, you know, I think we all know is not unexpected, if we'd asked that question, I'm pretty sure we would have said we'll get 100% dropout rate. There's no other way we could assess that dropout. All we can do is have exceptions that would hopefully begin to address where it's not going to work, and they would be the people who would actually drop out a system.
Just finally say then that the people that for whom the mitigation measures aren't adequate and they will still drop out, they're the people that are not taken into account properly by this, and you can't mitigate against that, and that's the problem with this approach. There will be a group of people for whom mitigation has not been successful, and that is the true measure of the success of this policy, I'm afraid. If you've still got that group of people that you can't accommodate in any way, that's a measure of the failure of this policy.
I think the first thing I would say in that is we have no evidence of that yet. What I would say is going through the system, if we have clear issues with it and significant issues, we would want to go back and review how we were operating it and then discuss that with members.
Thank you. Mr. Payne, you wanted to come in on that question?
Yes, I know the director's not paid to make quasi-political comments, so I'll do it instead, which is probably perhaps my role. All I'd like to say, I appreciate the point that Mr. Sheehan's making. Again, I reiterate, we know this is a sensitive area, and, if we had an abundance of resource, what have you, maybe this is one area, that would be looking at perhaps offering, even a more enhanced service than what we currently do, in spite of it being discretionary. But the reality is, we have to find a system of way of making the savings that we need to make and making sure the services that we offer can be delivered within the resource envelope. And the point I'd make to Mr. Sheehan is, we can't speculate on what may be, what may not be. We have to, at some point, get on with a policy and then review it based on actual outturn, the facts and the evidence that comes forward from that. So I hear the point that's being made, but there'll be a point in time where we look back and we assess whether the policy's worked or not. And if it doesn't work, we'll have to revisit it and tweak it as we do with other policies. And that's good management, in my opinion. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Hunt.
I'm staggered, we'll do this, but if it doesn't work, we'll come back and tweak it. It's not the kind of policy making that we're used to in this authority, but I'd just like to start off by saying that I can't possibly support this measure, and I can't possibly have it on my conscience that we are hurting so many families who've got so many obstacles in their lives on a daily basis, and you only have to compare the ease in which most people can get their children to school compared to the range of things that you have to do as a family to ensure that a child or a 16-plus-year-old with significant educational needs has to get to school, and those needs are diverse. So that's where I start from. And I thought that the consultation that we had last time was very good because it was a qualitative piece of work. It was asking people about their circumstances, how they would react to all the various measures. There were 3 particular packages of measures. And as a piece of qualitative research, it was good. I have to say, as a piece of quantitative research, this is neither appropriate nor particularly good, even with a chi-square test here and there. So I'm afraid I put rather that to the side, although all the evidence in it, such that it is saying that people don't want it. We knew that anyway. Mr. Bolton and Mr. Sheehan have referred to the hidden costs of this, the fact that there will be inevitably an under-take-up of places and implications on the rest of social care services that we don't yet know about. And officers have said at the moment, we haven't done that work, and in a sense we can't do it until we've started the pilot, maybe. But we're not starting a pilot, we're starting it full on. If we go back to the 3 options that we were offered last time, there was a measure of support, and I recognise this for the option, the proposal 2, which was an effect on post-16 SEN. But actually, although the proposers of this have been saying that this is a better deal than was put forward, certainly not a better deal than this committee wanted. This committee was for proposal 2, and this is worse than proposal 2. And putting an extra financial burden over the current options, I think, is just not acceptable. The evidence for the proposals put forward seem to me pretty thin, and when it comes down to it, that's the evidence about doing anything. It comes down to finance and resources, and we all understand that. We all understand that resources are tighter and tighter every year. But in my opinion, that's not sufficient to target this particular service over another. And I think there are other services. I don't live very far away from Bow Manor Hall, which is a country house that we own. I think there are efforts to make that pay its way even better. but many services, including contract bus services, which I know some of the members around this table wouldn't like to have removed either. But if you contrast whether we remove contract bus services for the general public to specific services for children who badly need the education that is provided here, I don't think there's a contest. So I think there are other options. And finally, to the mitigation, I actually went to this section before I'd read the whole document, because I thought this might be the answer. And it puts forward, I think, 5 mitigation circumstances, resting heavily on the appeals, but also resting on working with schools, better information, a robust escalation mechanism. I'm not quite sure what that was, but it sounded good. Now, you'll permit me, I'd just like to say that with the help of officers, I attended one of the appeals recently for a child going to school, of school age and so on, with a disability. It was a very complex process. It needed to rest on precedent and law. We were confronted by a barrister, solicitor, and 2 or 3 people who are well versed in the appeals process. The thing that struck me was, before I entered this appeal system with my residents' family, I was told, actually, Max, this is not such an uncommon circumstance. The situation you've got here with a child who's severely disabled and parents and so on, is not that common. And immediately you thought, actually, we're not going to win this appeal, because what we're presenting, to me, probably everybody in this room, looked like an open and shut case, but compared to the number of people in difficult circumstances, we were never going to get through that appeal. So my sense that appeals process is the answer is now quite compromised and somewhat disappointed, really. So I haven't got any questions, Chair, but I'd like our comments to go to Cabinet. And okay, when we're talking about personal transport budgets, PTBs, I'd say to Mr. Payne, PTB, please try better. Thank you.
That's not very good English, Max, but I know what you mean. Anne, did you pick anything up there you want to comment on, or Blake? No? In which case, we'll move to Mrs. Taylor, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for inviting us here today. Just one point, a lot of my questions have already been answered, but on page 26, under point 55, Roman numeral 5, about the, you've already touched on it earlier, about we don't want children going into care as a result of transport pressures, and it states there that the Children and Family Service will develop a robust escalation mechanism in place with schools. I'm just a bit curious about what you see that looking like, what training is going to be within the schools for them to be able to pick up that there might be a risk of that child going into care because of transport assessments. And it also mentions about being fast-tracked, and just what do we mean by fast-tracked? How long would the fast-track take? So just a bit more information on that, please.
Can I ask Tony Kirk, the Head of Service for that ED, to respond to this one, Chair?
Welcome, Tony. Over to you.
Thank you, Chair. The escalation process needs to be developed, but one of the things that we would look for is level of attendance, because clearly if the child's being transported and stops being transported, the school can pretty quickly spot they're not in school. We'll also know, because we get reports and we monitor the level of attendance against the personal transport budget, so we can have a look and ask the school from the other way as well. We'll work with our colleagues in SEND to develop that process should these proposals be agreed by Cabinet.
Thank you. Mrs. Taylor, is anything else?
Just how would that show that a child was likely to be taken into care, though? That's just saying that they're not attending school. So what transport pressures do you think would force a child to be moved into care?
I think that's the transport pressure and the lack of attendance at school is potentially the start of that process, but also the school would understand the child and flag that up as well. That's a process that we need to discuss with the school, much as the approach around getting the school to potentially help with transport for groups of students. We've not started those discussions yet because we didn't want to prejudge the consultation outcomes or the decision of Cabinet. But it's something on the agenda to start straight away if the proposals are agreed.
Thank you. Mr. Pearson. Oh, Anne, you'd like to come in?
Sorry, can I just say, Tony has also very efficiently got the response to Dr. Bremner's 29% question, if that's all right, if he could come back on that one.
Tony's a mine of information. We knew it would be there somewhere. Tony, please.
If I can refer to page 54 in the report, and you'll see that there's some homeschool transport policies public consultation survey results, which are grouped as the key concerns of parents by pulling together what they'd said in that longer document that Councillor Hunt referred to. And if you have a look at chart 14, the impact of the proposal on families, e.g. health, ability to work, relationships, is 29%. So it was 29% of the total comments. And then below you've got personal transport budget limitation, insufficient amount, 27%. So it's taking all of those free flow comments and trying to put them into areas and bunch them to get an idea of what was the most important. And the one about that negative impact was the one that came out top.
Does that give you any clarity, Dr. Bremner? Thank you very much, Tony. Christine, yes, Mrs. Radford, please.
Yeah, just one quick one. I mean, people are saying that they're concerned about the personal budget for transport, but it's been stated that about 130 took it up and only 4 dropped out. So it does show that those that have taken it up are liking the system and working with it. So I think that's a positive outcome to me. You know, people might be a little bit frightened of taking it up, but those that have, it obviously works. And the 4 that have dropped out, I'm assuming that we've gone back and supported them with other types of transport. We've not just said, well, you tried it, hard luck. You know, you're on your own now. So I can't see a problem. Thank you.
Can you give me some clarity, please, of the 4 that have dropped out? Can you tell us, Tony? Well past. Tony, can you tell us what's happened to them?
Yeah, it's difficult to form a conclusion because they were for different reasons. One, there was a change, I believe, in family circumstances, so it wasn't as convenient for them to transport. Another family felt that it wasn't enough money once they'd started doing it. Another one felt it wasn't enough money, full stop, and there was no reason given for the 4th one. So we don't ask for a reason because it's on a voluntary basis, and we allow people to give a month's notice if it's not working for them. But clearly that's the voluntary basis on which we organise the PTBs at the moment. If this policy goes through, and for post-16 we're going to say to people, we'll offer you a PTB, and then there is an exception, we would have to work through the exception process on a case-by-case basis.
Thank you. Mr. Hunt, you wanted to comment?
Just say, Chair, that the 3rd bullet point on Annie Bannister's report talks at some length about personal transport budgets. And in particular, she says families who are currently not using PTBs chose not to do so for good reasons. So whilst I quite accept what Mrs. Radford says, that the majority of those who took it up continued to use it, that was only those who chose to pick it up. And what we're asking now is for everybody to pick them up. That's the difference.
Yes, I think that's the point the director made earlier on, wasn't it?
Okay. Beg your pardon.
Okay. Mr. Pearson would like to come back for a second time.
Yeah, just a little response to some of the comments and to Mr. Bolter. Having worked in this field for many, many years, I can remember going on marches with families with people with disabilities, people with disabilities. In fact, I was secretary of a group called People with Disabilities. They didn't want a womb to the tomb service. They didn't want to be controlled by councils. They didn't want to be told what to do. And I don't think anybody around here, if I walked into your house and started telling you about your children, your family, what was best for them, we shouldn't be doing that. Throughout the world, not just England, people with disabilities have a right to self-determination. That means controlling their own budgets, controlling their own transport where possible. Surely, as a council, we should be supporting that. And if we get it right, the ones who need it most, which we've discussed, will then get a better service. But it takes a guts and a belief that we can do that. So I do think this is a whole service issue, not just transport. I totally support people with disabilities and families, but I support that we resource them. We don't go into people's houses and start telling them how to control the babies. We give them resources of information about cot deaths. We talk about breastfeeding. We give education and training. Surely that's what we should be doing in this case. And where there is need, I think we've touched on it, we want to. But surely we can't womb to the tomb service. Years ago, we had institutions where we locked people away with disabilities to protect them. Didn't we? We did. People with psychiatric. I worked in a hospital where we locked people away, some of them quite sane, because we were protecting them. We need to give them the self-determination and ability to run their own finances, and if they don't, we help them. Surely that's the role of this council, and I believe that's what we're trying to do.
Mr. Bolter, you want to come back? Thank you, Mr. Bolter. Mr. Payne, you want to clear something up?
Yeah, just as a point of fact, clearly each destination attracts a different cost currently, but I'm reliably informed by the officers that the average PTB will be in the region of £2,100 passported over, and obviously it's already been spoken about the 50% discount and how that will be put on top on some instances, but it is a significant amount of money, and it's not far off the average that we're currently paying for those entitled at the moment.
Members, thank you all very much for your contributions. Your comments have been faithfully recorded and will be summarised in the report to Cabinet, I think it's a week tomorrow.
Can I Chair, that I'm not in favour of this course of action?
I think that was clear by your comments, Mr. Bolton.
Yes, but I don't think I want to register our names against it. I was simply like
So Mr. Bolter and Mr. Hunt would like their comments annotated with their names.
Yeah.
Mr. Bill didn't speak.
Yes, I'm asking now.
You want to be you wanted to be associated with that which Mr. Bolter said. Thank you. And Mr. Sheehan. And everybody else, I guess. But thank you. Can we move on now on to item 9? Thank Mrs. Seaton and Mrs. Taylor and Mr. Sheehan for joining us. You're most welcome to stay if you so desire, but we understand if you would rather go and have a cup of coffee. Thank you. Item 9. The Quarter 3 performance report, which will be starting on page 113 of your pack, and ask the Director of Environment and Transport, Anne Carruthers, to present the case for us. Thank you. not the case. We want to present the paper for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I shall present the paper. The report relates to Q3 of 17-18 financial year, or where that is not the case, it is specifically indicated for that particular performance indicator. 14 of the 19 indicators have been updated, 5 have improved, 3 have declined, and 6 are static. 4 have not been updated either because there is no new information available, is the usual reason for that. Overall, you'll see our position in the appendix there that summarises that there are 14 that are green, 4 that are amber, and 1 that is red. This hasn't largely changed from previous quarters, but the bits I will highlight for you are the proportion of household waste sent for reuse, recycling or composting has reduced by 1.4% to 48%, and that's just off our interim target of 50%. I would, however, point out we are in the second quartile when compared to comparator county authorities, which means we're in the top half of performers there, despite obviously just missing out on our target. The other sustainable waste indicators are achieving their targets. One we do like to speak about each time is the percentage waste recycled from LCC buildings. That has declined to 53% from 57%. The overall target you will see on that summary sheet is 70%. We do achieve 79% for County Hall. However, we find it more challenging at our community-based buildings. We have been taking some action to try and address this recently. Officers have visited those sites with a view to identifying recommendations and changes in operation that could be put into place to help increase those levels of recycling. One of the other things we've identified is in one particular location, we do have external bins that actually under the contract are required to be locked but are not, and could well be getting non-LCC waste deposited there, which doesn't then help, etc. So we are pursuing that under that contract. So there are some actions there taking place. However, again, as members are fully aware, we are currently revising our environment strategy, and that will be re-looking again at our targets to ensure we have realistic targets attached and probably more specific targets attached to some of these indicators, and that will be coming to committee in due course for your consideration and comments. In terms of CO2 emissions from LCC operations and also our CO2 energy consumption per metre square of LCC buildings, we have final figures for 16-17 because obviously that takes a while to go through the system in order to understand our position. Both of those have met their targets, which is good news. Road safety targets are all moving in the right direction. However, I would point out that the killed and seriously injured, while declining, moving in the right direction, it's gone from 207 to 204 this period, is still off target because our interim target there is 170. However, our next report will go into that in more detail, so I will not labour that one. Our NHT, that's our National Highways and Transport Survey results, have been issued, and I thought it was worthwhile just highlighting that the overall satisfaction with condition of our roads was 39.5% and on target. This actually, again, because I would want to highlight this with you, puts us first among all our comparator authorities across the country. Finally, the last one, bus patronage, unfortunately, is continuing to decline. It's down to 13 million passengers. The target is 13.6 million. And we do seem to have hit a plateau there. However, this similar trend is going on nationally on that one. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Anne. Members, over to you. Can I go to Mr. Bolter first, please?
Anne knows what I'm going to say. I've been harping now for over a year about this, so I'm sure that this new policy will come into place very soon. Can you give us any indication when it might come into place? That's the first one. And I had a message come through today, I think most members have had it today, that the percentage of recycling is going down for county councils all over the country, and we're not going to meet our targets that have been set. I think there might be some financial penalties for not meeting our recycling targets somewhere in the small print. So, you know, I'm concerned about that. But anyway, if Anne could respond about this figure, because I'd hate to have to come sit here in a few months' time and it still be the same. Thank you.
Anne, could you comment, please?
I would echo your feelings about hating to do that in future. In terms of our draft environment strategy, I'm going to say spring that we'll have the draft to be able to bring to you, but I'm going to use the government's definition of spring, which can stretch a wee bit into summer. This spring, this year, I will commit to 2018, absolutely. We had intended March, however, I know there's a wee bit slippage on that, so I'm going to say late spring to you.
Was there a second part to your question? Right. I think we'll record that. Mr. Bolter said that's enough. Yes. Mr. Payne, could you comment, please?
Yeah, I'll have a stab at trying to answer the second point about the environmental targets and the recycling targets. Jo isn't here with us today. I think the weather's got the better of her, who is the assistant director that looks after the waste department, as you know. I don't think I'm not. I certainly haven't been briefed whether there's a financial penalty for not meeting the targets, but of course they are European targets, and I guess part of the new DEFRA strategy is to try and address how we meet our own recycling targets moving forward post-Brexit. What I would say, and it's an argument or a debate we've had time over, is members might have seen Wales are clearly a good performing part of the UK when it comes to recycling, but of course they recycle food waste. And there are other systems in place in Wales that helps them achieve that target. We have a two-tier system, and we've spoken about this before. There are various different systems, recycling systems, waste disposal systems in operation across Leicestershire, let alone England. And if we are going to meet the current EU targets, there needs to be a whole system change within the country in order to meet those targets. We're simply not going to achieve that under the current system, so something's going to have to give if we have ambition to exceed 50, 60% recycling in the next 10, 15, 20 years.
Thank you. Yes, please do, Mr. Walter.
That's fine. I mean, my local authority has been directed to take its recycling to a company the other side of Leicester. They won't accept textiles. At the minute, as local authority, we collect textiles, shoes, handbags, oil, and everything else. The company you're selected to take our recycling from April doesn't accept those. So from April 1st, our authority will no longer be collecting those materials because of your direction. Now, you know, that's not our fault. That's your fault for choosing the supplier that won't recycle the materials we at the moment collect. So our recycling rates will go down. We're not collecting certain articles. So that's an example where the county council's inflicting their wishes on local authorities about the recycling. So, you know, if you want recycling rates up, you should have picked a supplier that actually recycles everything and not selective what it does.
Thank you, Mr. Walter. Mr. Payne, would you like to respond?
Yeah, just simply say and reiterate there are different systems across Leicestershire, let alone England, and that particular material type is not one that we're statutorily required to collect anyway, and I dare say would be counted against some of the current measures that we have to operate to. But, you know, it's an ambition of this council to increase our recycling, and like I say, we're going to have to look at a whole system change in order to achieve a greater ambition.
Thank you. Anybody else, any more comments? No? Thank you very much, members. Papers duly noted. Can we move on to item 10, road casualty reduction in Leicestershire, which begins on page 123 in your pack. Can I ask the Assistant Director, Ian Veers, to present this report? Ian.
Thank you, Chair. As members may be aware, we bring an annual report for Scrutiny about our approach to casualty reduction, looking at the 2016 full figures, how we collect that data, and our approach to achieving reductions in casualty reduction. This is always a comprehensive report, as it's something I know members of the public and ourselves take very, very seriously. and I'd just like to take you through a few of the highlights in the report, but Appendix C does contain a lot of detail and facts, but this is the level of work we do to identify what and how we can achieve casualty reduction. In Leicestershire, in 2016, I'll start off with slightly bad news. There were 5 more people killed on our roads than there was in the previous year. However, the trend is currently declining, which is good news. And the provisional figures so far for 2017, there were only 17 people, over 50% reduction. But that shows the variances that you can have year on year in reductions, but always something nice to see. Total casualties dropped by more than 10%. However, with the very intense scrutiny we do, one of the things I'd like to point out that casualties for older road users, 60 and over, actually rose by over 50%, from 30 to 45 in the serious bracket. That is obviously an area of work that's concerned, because that's statistically quite a high increase, and it is something we'll be looking at further to see how and the work we do, especially on behaviour for older drivers, can be further rolled out to address anything in that area. Provisional data for 2000 for this area as well also showed, unfortunately, that vulnerable users such as cyclists also had an increase. Now, however, there has been a large increase across the UK as a whole. However, in Leicestershire, where we have been having increases in cycling as the national average, we have one of the lowest cyclist casualty rates in the country, which is, whilst good to have, it's not something we would ever rest on our laurels. The interesting fact about cyclist accidents is, as there are so few, their number, and it's hard always to find a causation, so in a particular site or area, and often it's down to behaviour programmes or working with the police or other road organisations where we can influence behaviour. As mentioned earlier by the Director, we have undertaken, as we said we would, a review of our casualty targets. Whilst our targets will remain the same, the government's decreased by 40%, we had trajectories in place to guide us on our way, which are reported in our quarterly reports. In 2013, as we'd already met our targets at that time, we reviewed our targets, looking to make them more stretching, and that was immediately followed by an increase nationally in casualty figures, which Leicestershire also had. I'm pleased to say we're now back on trend going downwards, and the only casualty trend, not target, we would look to change is back to the original, is that for the killed or seriously injured. In that way, we will have a better performance monitoring against a realistic milestone. I recently gave a presentation to all members regarding our approach to casualty reduction, and whilst that is repeated in the report, I didn't intend to go through that again here. Also included in the report in Appendix E is the work and programmes we have done and will continue to do in the future, be they engineering schemes, behavioural change programmes, or working with enforcement agencies such as the police. And I think a couple of things I would point out is we will soon be rolling out our pilot project for community speed enforcement. For those who know, we discussed last time average speed cameras across Leicestershire. And also a new programme that has been identified through our work for rural road casualties. That's 60-mile-an-hour roads where they have a higher than average anticipated level of accidents, and they're detailed in the report as well. So to conclude, before I'm happy to take questions, Leicestershire has some of the safest roads, and its drivers perform very well when they're using them. We will continue to look at the evidence that we have to define programmes that we can do to address those accidents. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian, for a very, very full report. Members, over to you. Anybody got any questions or points I'd like to raise with Ian? Mr. Hunt.
Quite briefly, I thought it was an excellent report with lots of useful information which can send us away in the confidence that officers have put this issue right front and centre of what we do. The particular point I'd just like to draw attention to the committee, which we hopefully will revisit later on, is this business of killed and seriously injured accidents or casualties on the one hand, and less serious on the other. And what's bugged me for a long time is that the less serious injuries form the bulk of the injury statistics. and yet they're not measured consistently or by any clear yardstick. So you might get somebody going to have some treatment because they'd like the insurance on their whiplash injury, which apparently has been quite common, or it might be somebody who's actually quite off work for a long time and has suffered, but is still classified as a slight injury. So those statistics are distorting almost everything else, which is why I always go to look at the killed and seriously injured as the real litmus test of how we're doing it. And I'm pleased to see that we're not doing bad. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hunt. Ian, would you like to comment on Mr. Hunt's point?
Yes. As with all evidence, the national system we have for information being collected by the police and reported is the national system, so it is the best that we can use to compare evidentially. The evidence we get from the reported casualty figures through the police is an indicator of where we need to look. We also use quite heavily people's opinions for what they write into us. My traffic and signals team receives 3,500 suggestions for what could be better done on the network, and I'm sure members have passed some of those on in their time. We look at all evidence we have, both anecdotal and empirical, to decide what could and wouldn't be achieved. The thing I would say is these often point the casualty figures to either specific locations or lengths for engineering measures. What we also look at, such as with the older drivers or the type of user, we can also look to the behavioural change programmes, and a lot of the work we do through the Leicestershire and Rutland Road Safety Partnership carries out campaigns around the Fatal Four for drink, drugs, driving or using mobile phones. So we use the evidence, but it's not the only piece we use. Thank you.
Whilst on the subject of older drivers, Ian, we're told regularly, however you see fit to comment, Mr. Bolter.
You were going to walk home after that.
We're constantly told that the population is ageing. So if that's true, and I have no reason to suspect it isn't, then we would expect to see a corresponding increase in accidents relating to older people. Do you know of any correlation between these two increases?
I think the reason why I mentioned the 50% increase, obviously the population didn't get 50% older overnight and all suddenly jump into the 60s despite the baby boomer. I am aware, and I know that my father would say that his generation was some of the safest drivers on the road, and I know some of the younger drivers might disagree. I think what we do is, yes, drivers are getting older, but we need the statistical evidence to say why they're not. One of the programs we do run, though, to address that is equipping those older drivers with the skills for the modern conditions on the road. And I would suggest that any of our members of the committee who would like to try one of those, I'm more than happy to arrange it.
I'm not sure how many of us qualify for under the age rule, but we'll move forward on that. Thank you. Mr. Sheehan.
Okay. Yes, very pleased to see that there's been a focus on cluster sites, Appendix H, which lists, goodness me, 67 of them, is it? No, it's more than that. It's probably quite a few dozens, must be above 100. Okay, but you did a very good job on one in my patch and Mr. Coxon's patch as well, 5 Lanes End, which is partly Ashby, partly Measham. I noticed there's another one in my patch on the list. I'll be interested to talk to you after the meeting about that and what you're actually proposing, what your timescales are, and what input I can have as a local member.
Can you take patch issues offline, Mr. Sheehan? Would you do that, Ian?
Just to clarify, the list you have there is the initial sift we do for sites over 7 indications within 5 years. That's what we reported here. We then work through those and then look for causations of sites we've already treated. If there were 7 individual accidents for varied reasons that couldn't be treated, then the site wouldn't take forward. It actually details further in the report, out of those 67, we've only got 5 sites that actually come forward as actual sites. So I can discuss patch issues afterwards on why they've not been taken forward, but that's only an initial indication sift.
Thank you. That would be very helpful to Mr. Sheehan. Thank you. Dr. Bremner, please.
Thank you, Chair. It's perhaps going back over things, but just to reiterate, on page 131, paragraph 50, we've just talked about a list in Appendix H, but my concern is if we're not quite clear what is in the police data, then some things could change in that list depending on how accurate the data is. So if the policy was changed in February 2016, do we need to, forgive the expression, but chase the police to get them to report more accurate data? If that is the case, if it is accuracy or just, I'm not quite sure.
You can chase Dr. Bremner, but I'll ask Ian to make comment on it.
Thank you, Chair. My little sister, who's a chief inspector, I would never chase. So. Yes, we do have a concern about the changes nationally in the way that people now no longer the police follow up on all instances, and we have noticed in Leicestershire a particular decline after the February figure. We have questioned the police already at length about this, and we will be raising again at the Road Safety Partnership Board meeting next week, where we wish to look further into that particular issue to get to the bottom of, is our data going forward going to be still statistically significant? The data we currently have, because it came in from 2016, still holds, because we look at the 5 years previously. Interestingly enough, though, as I was explained to members a bit earlier, the Department for Transport has just launched a new consultation on the way people can report accidents, not just casualty accidents. So we'll be looking at that consultation and replying to it. That may be giving us another statistical source on people's opinions, but also what's happening.
Thank you, Ian. There being no further indications, Mr. Payne would like to make a comment.
Yeah, just very quickly. Can I thank Ian and the department and the Road Safety Partnership, some sterling work here. I know all members because my inbox is frequently full of complaints about junction traffic movements and the perceived safety of certain junctions. Something I've asked to be undertaken some months ago now was around this police reporting, because while statistically we're aware of the severe and the injuries that take place that result in death at junctions, my communities do tell me that there are other accidents that they clock that don't necessarily get reported through the police system. So I think we really do need to do more to work with the police to understand their systems better and to see whether we're satisfied that their systems are working in terms of the data that it provides for us to make good analysis and forward planning. So I'm really pleased to hear that you'll be taking that back to the Road Safety Partnership and exploring that further, because it's important to every single member in this county council that those systems work. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Payne. Has everybody had the opportunity to ask what they want to ask? In which case, we'll move on to item 11, which is a reminder that our next meeting on Friday the 6th of April at 2 o'clock in this room, and I have not been notified of any urgent items which we need to bring up at this point, so it only remains for me to close the meeting. Thank you all for your contributions, and good afternoon.
I've noticed that ongoing programme about yellow lines. I'd like to know a little bit more about that. How are we going to be looking at that? Yellow lines at junctions, because I'm hi. Can you put that on the lead member meetings about the yellow lines at road junctions? Because I'm quite often being asked about yellow lines at junctions, and it's coming back. No, so can you give me a bit more information about?
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's as a result of